It's great to be kicking off our Design in the Biodiverse lecture series with Richard Weller. I'm Julia Zerniak. I'm a professor and associate dean at Syracuse Architecture. And I'm not going to spend too much time introducing Richard. I'm going to put his bio in the chat for those of you who want to learn more about him, but I will say a few things, which is Richard is the Meyerson Chair of Urbanism, Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture, and co-executive director of the Ian McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology at the University of Pennsylvania. Most relevant to us this afternoon is his recent research, which concerns global flashpoints between biodiversity and urban growth. This research is documented in his latest publication, a web-based platform titled Atlas for the End of the World, an atlas for the beginning of the Anthropocene. And the atlas analyzes, and we'll probably see some of this, how nations are performing with regard to reaching 2020 UN targets for protecting biodiversity, and it identifies conflict zones between growth and endangered species. So Richard, we're thrilled to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. So I've got a few slides by way of introduction, just to sort of set the scene and really to tell you what the lecture is not going to be about before I get into telling you what the lecture is really about. But the first slide that you see on the screen now is a collection of eye candy from almost a career, right, in design. And the reason I put that up is when I came to Penn almost 10 years ago now, but for the last 8 years, I've been working on research related at a global scale related to urbanization and biodiversity, let's say. But I don't want you to think that that's all I do, like large scale planning. I come out of a career that has really been very deliberate in terms of trying to work across the scales of landscape architecture. And that means working on very tiny, finely crafted things like gardens or public spaces, waterfronts, museums. But then I intended and selected projects very carefully and curated the whole thing so that I could scale up and test different methods at different scales, as if to kind of intentionally test the limitations of the discipline itself. That's been my academic adventure. And so I've worked on suburbs, whole cities, even nations. And now, yes, I'm working at a planetary scale, which of course, some people would roll their eyes and think that just sounds like hubris, but it's not intended that way. It's simply a recognition that contemporary culture is effectively global, and there are many other organizations that operate at a global scale. So why shouldn't design try to develop methods by which design can participate in that and shape that? I mean, the world has effectively already been completely designed. The planet has been designed. That is by definition what the Anthropocene means. It's just been designed badly. And so the world needs to be undesigned. And we can unpick it at very, very small scales or at medium scales or at large scales. And so the large scale just happens to be what I have tried to develop methods in relation to over the last 8 years. And I will be talking about those in the lecture when we get to it. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that the background to this is the literature of the Anthropocene. And the shock of climate change, the shock of the Anthropocene is by now settling in. And I think it's fundamental to the historical moment that we try to grapple with this. And so what you see on the screen is a quick collection of some of the literature as people in the humanities are kind of scrambled. It's almost like an intellectual panic to try and work out what's happening. And I think that's fascinating and really interesting, right? And I think design and visual culture and so on is clearly a part of that process of trying, on the one hand, the scientists are trying to model the Earth system as a whole to better understand how human infrastructure fits into that. And on the other hand, the humanities are sort of, as I said, working really rapidly to try and understand what it means and what it might mean to now decenter the anthropos, the human, and how we might live on a denatured planet, a climate changed planet, and whether we can possibly get through this ecological bottleneck of the 21st century and reach a more symbiotic state with the planet whereby we can survive, and so too, therefore, can many other things, many other species, which is ostensibly the subject of today's lecture. As a subset of the literature on the Anthropocene that I think you all need to become familiar with is, for those of you that are interested in animals, there is a literature in terms of animal studies, human-animal studies, and human-animal relationships. And I think, I'm not going to refer to that. Today is not about that. I'm going to show you the work I've been doing in terms of design and planning that tries to get at the problem of human-animal relationships. But I did want to draw to your attention that there is a literature that this work that I've been doing is in some ways based upon. And it's relevant to my particular discipline of landscape architecture because the subject of animals are conspicuously absent in landscape architecture. The field has placed a priority on plants. And so with that absence in mind, the work I'm doing is in part a kind of a correction of that. There has been some writing in landscape architecture recently as animals are a subject that people are taking more seriously. And recently, Kevin Klosterwill, a guy from Virginia, I think that's where he's based, wrote a paper and classified the last few centuries of landscape architecture into the following three categories: the scenic animal, the systemic animal, and the social animal, with regard to animals, right? And the scenic animal is, of course, the use of animals in picturesque tableaux. And I think we can add to that, you know, it's the scenic animal is the aristocratic landscape and the use of agricultural landscapes. The thing that we could probably add to that is the zoological gaze. In other words, designing zoological environments. Landscape architects have done some work there, but the picturesque and the zoological are essentially reinforcements of the human gaze and reinforce an animal-human dualism, a subject-object dualism, and ultimately a nature-culture dualism. The systemic animal, landscape architecture has had some engagement with the systemic animal, but the systemic animal refers to a scale of landscape planning, things such as green corridors, large-scale planning, which I'm going to show you some of in a moment, because that's really important work. But in the 20th century, large-scale landscape planning kind of reduced the animal to just a digit in the sort of pixelated, you know, overview of planning strategies. And so, you know, that the interest there was in species population, species migrations to an extent. These are critical issues that I will get to today, and they are ongoing. They're more critical than they've ever been, but the question is how we now design for those issues. And finally, the social animal relates to work which is, I think, connected much. There's very little of the social in animal in contemporary landscape architecture, but what it means is, and what it relates to in Klosterwill's formulation of it, is effectively a decentering of the human and a higher degree of trying through design to forge a higher degree of empathy between the animal and the human. And how you do that is, of course, the question. And I think that's the sort of work that is emerging and probably the sort of work that I think is most interesting, but it tends to operate at a very, very small scale. It's really about the intimacy between the human and the animal. We tested this to an extent recently through the journal that I edit here at Penn, LA+, by launching an international competition where the subject was the question of human-animal relations. And what was interesting about what this did was it sort of provided us with a body of evidence with over 260 entries received. It gave us a very good snapshot of what designers around the world are thinking about and what their anxieties are and interests are regarding human-animal identities. And so I could, if I was to interpret the 260 entries as a result of this competition, I would break them down into the following categories. And I'm just trying to give you a sort of, it's a basic taxonomy, as it were, following on from what Costerwill did with the scenic animal, the systemic and the social. I would replace those by slightly more aesthetic and nuanced and suggestive terms, and they would be the rewilds, the green machines, and the monsters. And I think you can package what contemporary designers are doing with animals into these categories. The rewilds essentially means work which is what the conservation community expects. That is, rewilding, returning species to their habitats if they've been removed from them, moving species to new habitats, reinstating or rewilding large areas of landscape, and giving back land and restoring ecosystems. And this work is really important. It tends to situate the human subject as a kind of enlightened steward of the land, and the human and the animal are going through a kind of a healing process. So it is really important work, but the problem with it is that it tends to, the aesthetics of it tend to reinforce a nature-culture duality, and that it tends to come with heavy doses of nostalgia, not to say sentimentality, for a world that is less damaged than the world that we currently live in. But nothing to be dismissed. It's really important work. And in fact, I think design and designers should work in much closer proximity to conservation and conservationists and the global conservation movement. The green machines is a slightly different approach, and that is designs that fit into this category, I think, accept that the world is denatured. There can be no return to a pure nature and any kind of innocence in that regard. The green machines tend to accept that the city itself and an urbanized planet is a new kind of nature. And what needs to happen is that the animal and animals and plants, for that matter, and the microbiological realm and all living matter needs to be grafted onto urban environments in novel ways. So designers tend to get more excited about this kind of work because it's, it moves fairly quickly into the realm of the cyborgian and the architectural and the novel. It rests within a familiar paradigm of design as innovation. And yes, design can solve most of our problems. We can design our way out of this. And technology is going to, save the day. The monsters, on the other hand, are perhaps the most interesting. And the monsters really relate to, I think, a whole lot of undercurrents in contemporary art discourse and contemporary literature regarding human-animal relations. And the monsters, the aesthetics of the monsters, people that are designing in this manner that I would categorize as monstrous, are less interested in salvation or conservation even, or any kind of design as problem solving, as you would find with the green machines, let's say. The monsters are more circumspect about design's ability to solve any problems, but, or as a prerequisite to getting to a better world, the monsters argue that you need to first destabilize human identity fundamentally in lieu of the Anthropocene, and break down the distance between subject and object and amplify the intimacy between animal and human in ways which will often be grotesque and alarming and frightening. And so as I said, it's a more interesting category of work that actively pursues the indeterminacy of evolution's mutations and unforeseeable sort of emergences through kind of splicings of a polluted world with the biological inheritance that we have. So anyway, I also want to make the proviso. I know it's a little bit long-winded by way of introduction, but I do want to make the proviso that when I'm going to show you a lot of big stuff today. I don't want you to think, oh, he just does big. But I have certainly been working at a large scale for the last few years. But in my studios and working with students, we do work at a level of precision and intimacy at a smaller scale, because there is at that scale you can really bring into play the drama of the human-animal interaction, and so that's very interesting. And but it's just not the subject of today's lecture. Finally, by way of introduction, I want to make a very important point that the image of the charismatic megafauna on the left, the panda, is not biodiversity, but the handful of soil on the right is biodiversity. 10 billion microbes in one spoonful of soil. Now, I know pandas are important, possibly as keystone species. I'm not saying that they're not part of a biodiverse world. I'm just saying that the biodiversity needs to be understood as a proxy for healthy ecosystems, not as glamorous logo species for global conservation movements. And both play their role, but what I'm interested in is biodiversity in the full sense of the word. So really, to begin this, what I want you to do is focus on these two images of the world doctored from the same perspective. And they are accurate representations, although it's obviously work in Photoshop and so on, but they are spatially accurate in terms of their global perspective. Now, on the left, clearly you have the mesh of planetary urbanization created over the last 6,000 years. And on the right, you have the fragments of the world's current protected areas. So for the last 50 or 60 years, under the aegis of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, there has been a remarkable global effort by conservation NGOs and others to secure territory and place it under protection according to 6 different categories, 6 different levels of formally protected area. And so you can see that the difference between these two worlds is most notable, because urbanization, well, firstly, to reinforce the linguistic stereotypes, the world on the left, the world of urbanization, is referred to as culture, and the fragments of conservation locked up in so-called protected areas that you see on the right, we refer to still in terms of popular culture as something called nature. I would argue that these two terms no longer hold in separation, and separating them from any longer is dangerous and untenable. And what happens in the linguistic construct of the dualism between culture and nature is reinforced in the way in which we fabricate our world. And that has to date been exclusively to the advantage of humans and their pets, and resoundingly to the detriment of most other living things. And to continue in that manner is simply untenable. That's the fundamental teaching or lesson of the Anthropocene and climate change. And so the world on the left is extraordinary. I don't mean to at all downplay it. It's an extraordinary achievement that a single species would design a planet. That's what's happened. That is an evolutionary phenomenon. And so we can marvel at it. And one of its key characteristics is it's based on connectivity, a kind of the seamless, the ideal of a frictionless world where goods and everything can move infrastructure and telecommunications, and we've created such a marvelous world for ourselves and for the movement of our ideas and our products, and funneled the resources of the natural world into that. What we're learning, however, is that it's also catastrophic. Its success could lead to its demise. I'll come back to that in a moment. On the other hand, the key characteristic of the world of conservation and biodiversity is now fragmentation, as you can quite clearly see from the image. All of these isolated fragments of protected area, unto themselves, they are achievements. Like, it's a real achievement politically, economically, and culturally to go into foreign territory and secure large chunks of it for the good of species other than the human. It's a profound achievement. But there's a fundamental problem with the fragmentation that you see on the image. As climate change accelerates, species that are corralled in and effectively trapped in these isolated fragments will not be able to move. The gene pool of global biodiversity can only survive climate change if it has planetary pathways through which it can migrate. When you look at the image, it's self-explanatory. An archipelago of fragments does not enable the pathways that species will need over time to migrate so as to adapt to the pressures of climate change. And so if we are to take biodiversity seriously, it really means reorganizing land use on a planetary scale. And the global conservation movement knows that. It's just that, I guess my argument is that it's not going to happen, or it could only happen through the ingenuity of design, because landscape is now such contested terrain. Every square inch of the planet has multiple pressures on it from multiple constituencies. There's no way that you can reorganize land use on a planetary scale vis-a-vis biodiversity's need to adapt to climate change unless you apply the skills of design and planning to landscapes. Now, the world on the left, of course, has been promulgated through specious notions of infinite growth, particularly economic ideals of infinite growth. Whereas the world on the right, the world of other species and conservation, is, of course, now in the midst of the sixth extinction. So for our paradigm of growth has been an apocalypse for everything else. And the challenge for us, of course, is that growth trajectory we're now learning is untenable. That's what climate change teaches us. And so the question is whether our economies and our cities and their supply chains can be restructured. The world that we have designed has to be undesigned and redesigned so that its relationship with the Earth system as a whole is symbiotic, not parasitical. There's two statistics on this slide too that I want to draw to your attention. 93% on the left, on the urbanized planet, and 17% on the right-hand image, the world of conservation. The 93% on the left simply means that if population gets to about 10 billion people sometime this century, as it almost definitely will, and if those 10 billion people consumed food in the way the average American does, let's say, or let's just say a developed world diet, then we would need, according to the current way in which we produce food, our current agricultural capacity, we would need 93% of the Earth's terrestrial, ice-free terrestrial surface. Okay, so now if you factor in that nearly 30% of the Earth's ice-free terrestrial surface is deserts, and I'm saying we're going to need 93% of the planet's ice-free terrestrial land just to produce the food according to today's. Now, of course, this might change if technology changes and new systems of food production and so on and so forth. But just extrapolating directly from the way in which we produce food today to a population of 10 billion people eating at the dietary standards of the average American, you'd need pretty much all the land on the planet, and you'd need to green the deserts. So that's a radical kind of geoengineering prospect just in order to feed people. So you need to ask them, well, if that's happening, to be realistic about it, where is biodiversity in that scenario? There's only 7% left, and that'll just be some alpine regions that we can't farm, right? I mean, that's a frightening future, I think. Now, the 17% on the conservation side of the equation is the current agreement globally. 196 nations are signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And from 2010 to 2020, those nations strived to meet a 17% target. This is known as Aichi target number 11. And it effectively means that the nations of the world, America is not one of them, and I think the other one is maybe Somalia, but all the other nations of the world have agreed to endeavour to set aside 17%, almost a fifth of their national territory for biodiversity. And so it's that number that gave me the hook that I needed for the formulation of a research question and a spatial analysis, which could, so that I could start to find a way into these issues from a design and planning perspective. And that's largely what I'm going to talk about. The 17% target, just say we are currently at about 15.4% globally. And so we didn't meet the target, basically. We've failed to meet the 2020 target. And so the question at the moment in the global conservation community is whether the targets will be reset. Some people are arguing for the targets now to be set at 30%, which is pretty interesting, that we would seriously, that 196 nations would seriously agree to set aside almost a third of their national territory as a conservation target, especially at the same time as I've just shown you that there will be incredible pressure on landscape in order for food production. They're two completely antithetical worlds, the world of food production and the world of conservation in terms of their footprints. We're at 15.4%, but there's three other words that I want you to be aware of, and these are the most important words in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they are representation, urbanization, and connectivity. Representation means that in order to achieve the 17% of protected area globally, and I'm not saying that's the right target, I'm just saying that's targets are part of a political game, but they're important. People, this is how things work. It might not, everything is actually about quality, not quantity, but be that as it may, quantity counts. And so in the political and economic sphere, the target of 17% has proven to be incredibly effective in terms of motivating nations to try and secure territory to set back territory for conservation. But what the word representation, why that's important, because this is the small print of the convention. It means that we can't now, if we wanted to meet the target of 17%, we can't go into Siberia and just set aside now a big chunk of land and sort of say we're done, right? Hooray, we met the UN targets and everything's good. Representation means that the 17% of protected area set aside for conservation should represent the world's biological diversity. So that means you need 17% set aside in each of the world's ecoregions, of which there are over 860. So the distribution of protected area cannot be like what you see on the world image on the screen, which is an ad hoc series of negotiation opportunism over the last 50 or 60 years. It has to be done with much more deliberately in terms of targeting the world's 860 or so ecoregions. So that starts to shift the conservation dollar and shift the emphasis on how the game is played in terms of setting land aside. Urbanisation, I think, needs no explanation for designers and planners and architects and landscape architects, at least. Urbanisation is the dominant force of the late 20th and 21st century. We know that. And so it has to be negotiated. There will be no future for conservation unless it's coupled with urbanisation. And by urbanisation, I also mean the supply chains of urbanisation. So I mean the agricultural landscape, etc. Connectivity gets back to the point I was making earlier about the fact that the global the genetic stock of biodiversity, in order for it to endure and evolve and survive, it needs pathways, and that's captured by the expression connectivity. Essentially, you need pathways between all of the fragments that you see on the image on the screen. And so nations around the world are currently trying to achieve representation by securing territory within their ecoregions. They're trying, although this is really early days, but they're trying to control urbanisation, and they're trying to achieve connectivity. And all of this is happening under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there are almost no designers and no planners involved. So the most important restructuring of life as we know it in terms of landscape and conservation values, the biological stock of the planet, is at a moment in time when it needs to be reorganized, and we're not there. And so that's what motivated my research and does to this day. Now, what does this represent? This represents the difference between the 15.4% that the world has achieved in terms of setting aside protected area and the 17% target. Because you think it's not much, right? You think it's only 1.6% of the Earth's terrestrial surface we need to secure. Well, it's actually a lot when you multiply it out by Central Park, just so you get a sense of the scale. It's nearly 700,000 Central Parks, equals 1.6% of the world's terrestrial surface. So that's important because that's a resource within the current political framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which these nations have kind of legally signed up to. They've legally agreed to find nearly 700,000 central parks in their national sovereign territory. And the reason that's important is because that gives you a kind of an empirical thing to work with as a spatial planner or designer, and to make sense of that. That's a resource. And it's also a resource that gives you the possibility of forging connectivity. Because if I put those central parks end to end, they go around the Earth nearly 70 times. So that to me is a kind of a golden thread of connectivity, that nations, they've agreed to give up that land. And so the question then is, really, the question becomes, well, where should that land be? Where should those 700,000 central parks be secured as a matter of priority? And that was the research question that I've been working with. And the simple answer, I think, the sort of self-evident, the commonsensical answer is, as a priority, the land that we secure for biodiversity should, it seems logical, occur in the parts of the world where the greatest biodiversity exists and where that biodiversity is most threatened. And that leads you directly to the world's 36 biological hotspots that are shown on this world map highlighted. They are the regions where the creative genetic inheritance of life on Earth, I mean, what those areas of land on this world map represent to global biodiversity, to life on Earth, is very much the same as what a library represents to culture. So as you bulldoze and burn these territories on this image of the world, it's akin to bulldozing and burning the libraries in terms of human culture. And so as a matter of priority, the 1.6% of global terrestrial area that we need to secure under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity should take place in these areas as a matter of priority. It seems, so that's been my argument. And that was the way in which we argued that and then presented it. And I've shifted my work here from speaking back to designers always talking to designers. And I've tried to shift the results of my work across to the conservation community and demonstrate to them that, as well as all the good science that they do, designers have a role to play in terms of spatializing these problems and visualizing these problems and helping create landscapes of the future where the complexity of the way in which urbanization, agriculture, and all these other vested interests and biodiversity can coexist. So the Atlas for the End of the World was a huge project to try and conduct an audit of how all the nations in the world's in the biodiversity hotspots are performing vis-a-vis the 17% target. And most nations have not mapped that because they don't want to be embarrassed. Having signed up to the convention, they don't want to be embarrassed by maps that show that they're not meeting their targets. But it was also a cultural piece of work in the sense that it was the reason we called it an atlas was because the first map of the world that was packaged as part of an atlas was in 1570 by Abraham Ortelius in Antwerp, called the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the theatre of the world. And it was in 1570 when he drew this image of the world's ecosystems were largely intact. So this is really the beginning of modernity. This is the beginning of the colonial project and the decimation of the world's biodiversity. And so at the other end of that, some 500 years later, this project, the Atlas for the End of the World, of course, the world's not ending. What is ending is Ortelius's world, a world where, you know, of infinite resources, of a nature that can be plundered and peoples that can be exploited. And so an atlas 500 years later, with its pessimistic title, is really about raking over the remains of the project of modernity and seeing what's left. And you can do that through GIS and simply audit land use and land area, and you can calculate quite precisely what is left. And that's what the atlas does, among other things. And so when we do that, we can get very clear results. The areas that you see in green on this map have met their targets. They're doing okay. You can give them a tick. They've secured 17% of the eco-regions in their national sovereign territory. All of the other areas have not. And so they're defaulting on their commitments. And that help. Maps like this are powerful in the sense that it can shape arguments, it can direct investment, and it can prioritize where the energy should be put in terms of the urgency of protecting biodiversity globally. And it was just extraordinary to me that no one had done this. It's the dumbest thing. It's just an audit. In any event, the atlas includes. Then we swing across to urbanization because it's the dominant force, right? And to avoid this world of urbanization on the one hand and conservation on the other, all the work I've been doing shuffles across those two all the time. And so when we studied the way in which urbanization is taking place in the world's biodiversity hotspots, the result of that analysis is this map. And this is a frightening image. What it means is that every yellow dot you see on this world map is a city defined by the United Nations as 300,000 people or more, which is rapidly sprawling, rapidly expanding. So it's got population growth and its peri-urban territory is exploding. And these cities are growing in direct conflict with endangered species and remnant habitat. So this is a bloodbath on a planetary scale. And nothing. I mean, the global planning and design community, this is happening under the radar. It's happening in a lot of territories where designers are not active. It's happening in a lot of areas of the world which are corrupt and complex. Not all, but a lot. And so it's a major problem, I think, in terms of how can design and planning approach this catastrophe. Because peri-urban sprawl of urban form is not a fait accompli. There are forces behind it. It's a cultural phenomenon. And if we keep it within the realm of culture, then we can contend it and we can redirect it. And that's been my argument. And so to build that argument, what we did was reduce the sample set down to a select group of cities that we call the hotspot cities, which are the biggest and the fastest growing cities in the world's biodiversity hotspots, which gives you this set of 32. Now, all of these cities are rapidly expanding, growing, and on a direct collision course with endangered species and remnant habitat. And so it was this group of cities that we could pull together into a conversation and treat them as if they were capital cities, not of their nations or their regions, but capitals of the hotspots, and argued that these cities should, as a matter of pride, they should endeavour to shape the future of their urbanisation with regard to the beauty of biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity, both aesthetically and scientifically. Many of these cities are growing around the world. They have little regard for biodiversity because they're largely unaware of its value. So that led to the Hotspot Cities project, which is specifically focusing on this set of cities, which is a website that you can go to should you have an interest. And it just provides a service, really. It breaks down each of these cities and gives you all the necessary data and sets the scene for design and planning to negotiate the peri-urban territories where this is happening. And the maps look like this. This is the full set. It's a little bit distant here in the image, but basically what you don't want to see is red. When you see red, what that means is that the forecast of urban expansion for that particular city, and where it's on a collision course with remnant habitat and endangered species, flashes up as red. So the way in which we've superimposed the data sets and done the mapping, it gives you that as a very clear indicator. Again, this was work that hasn't been done. And so that it just draws to attention really clearly for any particular city the problem. So this, for example, this zooms in a little bit to one. We've now started case studies with these particular cities. This is the case study of Bogota, capital of Colombia. So where you see red is the conflict zone. And so, you know, on the one hand, the city could just continue to expand and people would say, so what, that's what cities always do. Well, no. These cities have reached a point and where we value biodiversity that they cannot just do this. There's no reason for them to do this. If we could design them and plan them and redirect the forces of urbanisation, there is an opportunity here to synthesize urban growth. So of course, cities need to grow, but they should grow in particular ways. They should grow here and not there. And so the growth of cities can be curated in a way that is mindful of the biodiversity that is on the doorsteps of these cities. So I won't go into this in any detail because I'm already taking too long, but the case study of Bogota is published and documented. And we essentially tried to, as I did at the beginning of the lecture, with the image of planetary urbanisation on the one hand and conservation on the other, it's at a city scale, we do the same thing here. We prepared a thorough ecological plan for the city, as if urbanisation didn't really matter. And then we produced an urban plan for the city as if environmental values didn't really matter. So we optimised both approaches, if you like, and then we synthesised the two through a process of compromise, which is necessary. Part of the problem for cities is that urbanists and developers are not trained environmentally. And on the other hand, the environmentalists don't understand cities and they don't respect the dynamics of cities and the needs of urban economies and so on. So you do need, the role of the designer is clearly one of synthesis. And the role of the landscape architect is to come at these problems from both sides of the equation. It's only through doing that that we can hope to strike any measure of balance between these two typically antagonistic forces. So then you get a final plan that synthesizes a combination of environmental values and urban design values. So the final project I want to share with you is a pet project, and it gets back to this problem of fragmentation. And it strikes right at the issue of connectivity and the question of what we should do with these 700,000 central parks. And comes at it at a planetary scale from the perspective of a design proposal. And what's remarkable, before I show you that project, what's remarkable to learn is that there are many projects going on in the world today that are doing this. We've collected at the moment, we've got an archive of about 200 big projects which are occurring globally, where NGOs, conservationists, governments and communities are working together to try and achieve landscape connectivity on a planetary scale. Now that's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that humans are doing this, right? Effectively, as a historical moment, effectively treating the planet as a kind of a garden that needs to be designed, planned, and intentionally reorganized so as to create pathways for species. Now, not all these projects are about species migration. Some of them are about desertification and so on, such as the Great Green Wall across the Sahara in Africa. But generally speaking, these large-scale ecological projects, I think, constitute a new breed of project, and I think that's very interesting. The World Bank has really glommed onto this idea of nature-based solutions, and it's also running through the engineering profession, and everyone's talking about nature-based solutions. And I think it's really important. I don't like the expression, that's why I've put a line across it out. But it's important for landscape architecture to own this and to step up, because if they don't, others will and are. And I think just in terms of the semantics of the thing, I think it's better to call them landscape-based experiments, because it gets rid of all the baggage of nature for a start. But then secondly, it also gets rid of solutions, which is wrong. We don't know what we're doing. We're not going to make quick fix solutions. We've never really designed ecosystems intentionally. And so to do it now, the more modest word would be experiments. But you know, when you're dealing with clients and so on, and there's large scale investment, people don't want to hear about experiments. They want to think that there'll be a kind of quick fix solution. So I understand the efficacy of nature-based solutions, but it's a dangerous use of language, I think. A better term, and one we're using here at Penn, and I have a PhD student, Rob Leventhal, working on this now, is mega eco projects. And the reason I think that's the best way to explain it, to say it, the mega eco project places these projects back within the 20th century tradition of the mega project. And that's an intentional move, because many mega projects were always presented as if they were going to be great nation building success stories, and many of them were not. And so I think, even though I think it's important to do that now for these large scale ecological green projects, because many of them might also have unforeseen consequences. So we need to study them critically rather than just promote them as virtuous, right? So I think that's an important point. I won't go through the differences between the 20th century mega project and the 21st century mega eco project, but it is an interesting grouping of, it's an interesting evolution. And so I think these large scale projects are very much worthy of study, because we don't know much about them. They always come at you with lots of virtue. They always seem good. So I think it's a new topic for us to develop a taxonomy, to critically understand the mechanics of these projects, how they actually happen on the ground, what's the financing behind them, and the governance and so on. And that leads me to my pet project, which is the World Park Project. And this project has been bubbling away here at Penn for a few years, and with wonderful students working on it from time to time. And it's currently at the point where UNESCO is talking to me about conducting a formal feasibility study, which would be exciting, I think, if only to disprove it. The basic proposition is this, or the basic question was, how do we connect the world's biodiversity? How do we increase connectivity in the world's biodiversity hotspots And how do we involve humans in that project, as opposed to old school conservation, which typically saw humans as a threat and tried to secure land in spite of humans, right? And so a new paradigm of conservation is to get people out into these landscapes, get them working, because we need to reconstruct these landscapes. They're degraded. The biodiversity is threatened with extinction. So how do you do that? And how do you galvanize funding? At the moment, there's a lot of money moving around the world for conservation, but it moves around in an ad hoc manner. How do we galvanize those resources into one mega project that could capture the public imagination, create a kind of a labor force of people to get out into these remote territories and do the work of ecological restoration, and create connectivity for species other than the human? And here is my answer. And you can conduct this. I don't mean to make light of this, but you can do it almost as a sketch. You can draw a line through there, from Alaska down to Patagonia. You can draw a line through from Southern Africa up into Central Asia, or the southern Turkey. You can draw a line from the southeast of Australia right up through Central Asia across to Morocco. And those lines do a lot of work for you. They pick up a lot of the world's biodiversity hotspots with 3 lines. So it's a fairly, it's an elegant solution, let's say. But then the question is, well, what are these lines? And of course, they're walking trails. The most simple piece of infrastructure you could imagine is to create a pathway or a trail. It's cheap. And a pathway attracts humans, right? I mean, people increasingly love to walk. And these large-scale pathways invoke the whole kind of notion of pilgrimage, the beauty of walking and the poetry of pilgrimage and so on. But what they do is, these lines, when we take this to a scale of, when we get into the detail of it, these lines are organised through the land to pick up the protected areas along the way. So the way in which it works is, the pathways don't just go to all the most scenic territories. They cross from protected area to protected area to protected area. So forming literal connectivity between the protected areas in the world's biodiversity hotspots, but arguing that as people walk these pathways, they should effectively stop at the territories in between the protected areas, because the protected areas don't need any more work. It's the land in between the protected areas that is really degraded and needs to be restored. So that's the main aim of the so-called World Park project. So 3 trails connecting 19 hotspots involving 55 nations over 163,000 kilometres. The prospect of the park, should it be constructed, would lead to 163,000 kilometres of connected, restored habitat. And so, on the one hand, it's about tourism and walking, which is beautiful, but that's not good enough. It's really about working. And as I said, the main aim of the game, the aim of the project, is to focus on the territories along these pathways in between the protected areas, so as to forge connectivity via restored landscape systems between the protected areas there, in that way opening up pathways for species migration. So that's how everything I've just said is explained on that diagram. We won't dwell on that. And the maps, if you are interested, you can go to the website of the World Park Project and you can zoom right into these and explore. You can kind of effectively walk the trails through cartography. Here is the Pataska Trail from Alaska down to Patagonia. This is the Taribia Trail from Namibia up into southern Turkey. And this is what we're calling the Osrock Trail from southeastern Australia across to Morocco. And when you go onto the website, we've done hundreds and hundreds of maps and gotten it down to this level of detail. So it's still very coarse, but it's kind of getting there. Okay, so that's all I have for you. Thank you very much. I hope that's been of interest, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
I wish we could clap, but we are clapping. Thank you so very much, Richard. I think will you close your screen so we can see your face?
Sure.
Great.
Can you see me now?
I can. Yeah, and I'm going to.
Okay, good. All right.
So I do want to take questions from the crowd, but I do just want to pick up on, first of all, thank you for a very provocatively argued and researched body of work and a proposal. There was something you said that caught my attention, which was the little bit about UNESCO. And I'm wondering if you could share other places that you found that this work might gain agency. I mean, you know, you began your talk arguing that designers and landscape architects and planners were not at the table when a lot of these targets were set. Do you see that changing with this kind of work that might gain some kind of visibility?
Yes and no. I think the conservation community has a handle on this and they're suspicious of design. I don't think they yet have a reason to trust designers. And they tend to think that the science should drive everything, so they're not particularly open. But where the opportunity is arising is that as they try to do the work of achieving connectivity and as they try to deal with urbanization, they find themselves inevitably tangled up in design problems. And through that, they come closer to design thinking, which is comfortable with the complexity of the world. So, but it's still, I still think, in answer to your question, it really is up to us to demonstrate that we have something to contribute. The main clients for this kind of work are the NGOs. So designers and planners need to appeal to those organisations and work with those organisations. It's been a very interesting question for me. It depends because there's several things here. We've got the hotspot cities is kind of fairly traditional work in terms of urban planning and worrying about peri-urban growth. But projects like the World Park, that's a different story because that's a ridiculously large idea. And one of the interesting things about that was for me and the students was to just ask that question. Well, how do you promote such an idea? How do you get anyone to take this seriously? And so that's been, and you know, do you work for is it something that you take to Elon Musk, you know, these kinds of guys? That would have been a good argument, actually. You should have, you know, these guys that are blasting off into space, it should be like, you know, come back to Earth and do something significant down here. Bezos and Musk so, you know, on the one hand, we've kind of pushed parts of this work out to the philanthropic community. On the other hand, we've pushed it out to the NGO community. We've also pushed it out to governments. And so we're trying to play it in different, we're trying to play all these different possible constituencies. But at the moment, the most receptive, and I'm going on a bit here, but I thought the idea would be ridiculed and dismissed out of hand, and I was pleasantly surprised that it was not. It's been well received, which has been interesting. A lot of people have said, this is exactly what we need. We need a major breakthrough project, and they get it.
Yeah, and I think that even though it's not at the scale that you're thinking about, your work is certainly inspiring a whole nother generation of designers to think about connectivity at whatever scale they can think of it at. And I think that's really important. There's a question in the chat that I'll read. It says, thanks for sharing with the far reaches of the globe, Julia, and thanks for great representation, Richard. Oh, Kay Kite from New Zealand. No question there, just a comment. So that's nice. I'm wondering, I'm inviting whoever has a question, if you can either just unmute and ask it, or you can put the question in the chat. Here's a question.
Yeah. How does your methodology of understanding and representing?
Okay.
So the question is, how does your methodology of understanding and representing different species and habitats differ as you move from the extra large scale to the large and medium and vice versa? Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I don't think I have an answer for that. At the large scale, I think it's fairly, in the first instance, I think it's fairly simple. To achieve connectivity is not rocket science, and so you can start by, anyone can start by drawing big green lines on world maps. But that then gets tempered by the realities of land use. And it also gets tempered by the realities of when it gets species specific, that's when the connectivity, when the connectivity is assessed in terms of competing land uses, which is an economic landscape, and when it gets assessed in terms of specific species and their needs, that's when the rubber hits the road. And that's when connectivity has to be designed with precision. And to be honest with you, nobody knows how to do that. Like that, there is actually no answer. You cannot find, the scientific community is not in agreement about connectivity. No one can tell you how wide the connectivity should be. You could apply the precautionary principle and say, oh, let's just make it 2 miles wide, and we go as long as we need to go because we need to protect this patch here and this patch here. Sure, you can do that, assuming you can get the land and amalgamate the financing. So I think it's very interesting, right? It's very interesting to work out the actual design of connectivity. And you would do that as you would do any design process. You would just, go through the motions of trying to get the most bang for your buck. And there are precedents for learning that. The Y2Y from Yukon to Yellowstone, the Canadian, North American project, I think is a very good example, which is probably, it's been going for a long time. So there's a body of evidence there if you want to get into how it's working on the ground. But there are connectivity projects happening the world over where we are starting to learn the lessons of ways in which connectivity can be achieved. When you get down to smaller scales, I think it's fine. Then I think that's all comfortable for designers to work at smaller scales. I think you can get down to if you follow biodiversity, you can get down to the tiniest of scales. And what's interesting is you're just approaching designing the world differently. So instead of designing it for the human, as the human has always been our client, it's always been for the human. And to an extent, it still is. But if, in addition to the human, if you ask the question of any small project, any building, anything, any public space, any park, any riparian corridor, any peri-urban growth, or any connectivity on a larger regional scale, as you go through the scales, you simply have to ask what do the species that are implicated in this ecology in which I'm working, what do they need? What do they need to thrive? And just hold the human back for a minute. Put the human to one side. You don't tell your client that, you just do it. And you'll get a different design outcome. And I think that's the exciting part of this for designers. Once you tune into the fact that biodiversity is your clientele, you're going to get a different design result. And it's exciting.
Sure. Can you take another question, Richard, in the chat?
Yeah, sure. with regard to human and animal relations, as cities continue to encroach on endangered habitats, how do we communicate the importance of reintroducing apex predators to their former habitats for ecological health? I don't know. I mean, how do you communicate anything? How do you educate a public that the NGOs the conservation folks are usually pretty good at that through education campaigns. But ultimately, the problem with those sorts of species is that they're typically perceived as a threat by humans. And so that's where design comes in. Design needs to set up relationships that are safe for people, but increase the degree of intimacy between the human and other species. So design can pull people into these environments, bring them into a more proximal relationship with animals, but do so in a way that is non-threatening. That is the key to it, I think.
Fantastic.
But I also think the human has to be challenged. So it's not just about building, it's not just about Snowhead building gorgeous pavilions in reindeer landscapes, It's not, it is that, but it's not that. Actually, it's much more, it has to become more quotidian, more part of our lives. So the way you design a road, the way you design a bridge, the way you design a building, the way you design a sewerage system, the way you design publics, everything that we design, if it can to some degree incorporate other species, that to me seems like a really productive opening without being absurd. I mean, no one's talking about bison walking down Fifth Avenue, it's right. Cities are like, let's just be sensible about it. Cities are fantastic and more or less exclusively for one species, which is the human. The city is a human theatre. It's just that actually, I think what's happening now is we're becoming profoundly lonely. We're just on our own. And apart from some pigeons and dogs and a cat, it's getting lonely in the Anthropocene. And it's not just loneliness, as in, the kind of, the beauty of having multiple other species around you. It's a loneliness that comes also with the horror of realizing that you're nature's executioner, or we are. I mean, once you get that, it's like, okay, is that what we are? And so when I talk to my students, I'm fascinated by the way in which many of them feel a certain melancholia for what the world has become, and they were born into it. They were born into a world of climate change and to a world of degraded landscapes and the sixth extinction. And so as not to be overwhelmed by that, I think the design is inherently a positive thing to do and optimistic without being naively utopian.
Richard, let's take this one final question, if you will.
Which one?
It says,
For countries that want to participate in the project but are not directly in the collision course of the biodiversity hotspots, do you envision any ways for them to contribute on a isolated scale while still thinking globally? I think that question is related. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the question about the fact that when in the World Park proposal, there are 55 nations whose sovereign territory is actually involved, right? Directly implicated. They have to give up land, and therefore you'd expect that they would have to invest in it. But I think the world, and because it gets silly if you start drawing lines everywhere, trying to bring the whole world together. So it doesn't need to be that. I mean, nations contribute financially to things that are often not going on in their own territory and reap the benefits of that. I think the younger populations of every nation on earth people could certainly participate in it through the labour side of it. So the work that needs to be done on reconstructing these landscapes. Incidentally, we're now This is the first year of the United Nations decade of ecosystem restoration. So this is a timely thing. But to open up a global market, which is not a new idea, it's really just a conservation core, but to engage young people from many different nations on getting out into these landscapes, living there and working on the restoration, I think is a piece of the puzzle. But also nations that are not directly linked to the world park per se. Like, let's take Japan, it's an island, they can't be in the game. But there's no reason why Japan couldn't do a similar thing in terms of achieving connectivity through Japan, and the way in which they could do it or catalyze it might be through the same strategy of starting with a walking trail and getting young people off their computers and out of their rooms, out into these landscapes to do some work. Could be okay. And they could be part of the World Park as an institution, let's say. But this is the sort of, I don't know, I don't know how that would, I think about it, but I'm not sure how it would play out in that sense. Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing your research, and more so for sharing your optimism in the power of design. And we're really excited to see where the World Park goes.
Yep. Thanks, Julia.
Okay.
See you.
Out for now. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.